Have you ever wondered how the thinking process works? Imagine you're traveling on a train or lying in bed, and suddenly your brain starts juggling completely disparate ideas. Memories of past mistakes, future plans, shopping lists, existential musings that seem to come out of nowhere. It seems as if your mind is bored with monotony and has decided to put on a real circus. The most amazing thing about this is that we are so used to this state that silence, true silence, begins to cause discomfort. It feels like something is missing, like we're missing something important if our minds aren't busy constantly grinding away at our thoughts. But here's something worth realizing. Your desire for peace is not a sign of malfunction. Your need for mental quiet doesn't make you lazy. You're just human. Thinking is a powerful tool, but if you carry it around with you all the time, it will inevitably start to hurt. The truth is that human beings are not meant to exist solely in their heads. Often, instead of solving real problems, we only dwell on the same thoughts, replay old scenes in our heads, get into arguments with imaginary opponents. It drains our strength, and most of the time we don't even notice it happening. But what would happen if we tried to change it? In fact, the point of this video is not at all about achieving mental emptiness or contemplating mountain peaks in lotus pose. It's about more down-to-earth things, namely realizing that relentless thought work is not synonymous with mindfulness, but is often a distraction from it. If you are experiencing mental fatigue, anxiety, or a loss of the ability to be serene, then you should pay attention to this topic. Once you understand the causes of this condition, your perception of silence will never be the same. Again, most people do not realize how noisy their inner world has become. Once they become accustomed to this state, they consider it normal. However, familiar does not always mean healthy. We have become accustomed to the chaotic flow of thoughts, just as we have become accustomed to processing information. Mental exhaustion has become a kind of symbol of distinction, an indicator of being active. If the brain is not constantly generating ideas, worrying, and problem-solving, there is a feeling of lagging behind, of being unproductive. However, true mental clarity comes not as a result of mental clutter, but in those moments when you stop desperately trying to find answers to all questions. Think for a moment. When have the most vivid and insightful ideas come to you? It's unlikely to have happened in moments of feverish thinking and desperate attempts to find a solution. More likely, they occurred in hours of peace, during a leisurely walk, under a shower, or simply in moments of contemplating the ceiling. The truth is that insights come not when we strain our minds to the limit, but when we allow ourselves to stop and listen to our inner selves. Imagine your brain as a snow globe. If you shake it constantly, it is impossible to see anything through the swirl of snowflakes. But just leave it alone for a moment, and the picture will clear up on its own. Thought as such is not the enemy, but a continuous stream of thoughts is the real problem. Endless ruminations become noise that drowns out the voice of awareness. Awareness is not something to be achieved by willpower, but is something that manifests itself when the mental storm subsides and the dust of every day. Worries settles. This is where the most interesting things begin. When one stops clinging to every fleeting thought, one begins to notice that most of them carry no value. They are old, recycled ideas that have already been thought about and analyzed more than once. They come in the guise of urgent problems, but are really just echoes of past experiences, residual tensions, and half-formed anxieties that don't deserve attention. Man is not meant to live solely in a world of mental simulations. He must find harmony with the world around him and his inner self. That is why contact with nature is so beneficial. That is why music takes on a completely different sound when the listener detaches himself from the analytical approach and simply immerses himself in its melody. That is why the brightest moments of life happen without unnecessary words and explanations, but are filled with the feeling of being present in the moment. When a person stops seeing his or her thoughts as the central figure, he or she regains the ability to live life in its entirety, not just reflect on it. There is an important aspect that unfortunately is not commonly taught. Silence is not simply the absence of any activity, but rather a gateway that opens the way to true awareness. In a state of continuous thought process, one's attention is constantly several steps ahead of one's physical presence. Being mentally in the past, the future, in imaginary dialogues, or in endless to-do lists, he is rarely present where his feet are. For example, walking through a picturesque park on a beautiful day, but mentally reliving a quarrel that occurred a few days ago. The nervous system sees no difference between reality and imagination, perceiving the situation as if the person were still in a state of conflict. Therein lies the power of thoughts. The paradox, however, is that thoughts can only shape a person's life if he or she allows them to have undivided control over what happens without exercising any control. Man is not powerless in the face of his own thoughts, nor is he doomed to live in constant noise. He is simply accustomed to reacting to every thought as an important notice requiring immediate attention, although in most cases this is far from being the case. Has it ever happened to you that a sudden negative thought instantly darkened your entire mood? If you carefully analyze its origin, you will find that it appeared as if from nowhere. There is no real stimulus. It is just an ingrained habit, a fixation, a kind of mental muscle overdeveloped by constant use. It is in such moments that silence finds its true power, for silence is not passivity or inactivity. It is a deliberate distancing of oneself from the continuous flow of thoughts, enough to realize that it is not necessary to analyze absolutely everything. The most correct decisions, those that are made intuitively, are born in this state of inner silence. There is no need for excessive thinking, for convincing oneself in something, or, on the contrary, for dissuading oneself. There is simply a clear understanding coming from the depths of consciousness. This inner voice is not chaotic and intrusive. It is calm and self-confident, not requiring constant intervention. And it is here that a radical change takes place. By giving oneself a break from the continuous thought process, one does not become less aware, but on the contrary, one becomes more receptive. He begins to listen to himself, noticing things that previously escaped his attention. Life begins to unfold in its own way, without the need for constant monitoring, because clarity comes not from increased thinking, but from acquiring sufficient inner silence to hear what has always been there. This is about a problem that is often overshadowed when discussing overthinking. It is not just the flow of thoughts, but the relentless drive of the mind to comment on and interpret every moment of existence. Barely opening one's eyes, one is immersed in a continuous internal dialogue. Even during meals, the brain is not silent, issuing its comments. In moments of rest, intrusive thoughts torment with questions. Am I doing the right thing? Shouldn't I do something else? One gets the impression that one is never alone with oneself, because the mind has convinced him or her of the need to constantly explain, categorize, and evaluate every experience. This incessant noise is not only exhausting, but also distracting from authentic living. There is a huge difference between directly participating in the moment and observing it through the lens of thought. The former brings a sense of freedom and ease, like breathing, while the latter turns one into a bystander. The mind should not continuously track, categorize, and analyze life as if making a detailed report. Man is not a soulless machine, but a living being who is not meant to process reality, but to live it in its fullness. That is why one should not indulge in constant reflection. The more energy that is spent on the internal narrative of what is happening, the less energy is left to be truly present in the present moment and enjoy it. Whole horizons of perception only become available when one stops obsessively striving for them with the mind. Elusive changes in bodily sensations, emotions that do not require immediate correction, and suddenly arising ideas are all discovered in a state of resting mind. It is like tuning into a radio wave that until then has been hidden behind a shroud of mental noise. It is here that presence reveals its power, not in an abstract spiritual sense, but in a deeply human and practical aspect. Presence restores the lost connection with the natural intelligence, that inner knowing that does not need lists of pro and con arguments to determine what is right. It is that intelligence that does not rush to fill the silence with meaningless words, but instead notices more details, feels more deeply, and responds thoughtfully to what is happening. In a state of presence, there is no need to constantly analyze and explain the current moment, because one is completely immersed in it. And once one tastes this clarity, silence, and self-sufficiency, it becomes obvious how much unnecessary noise and anxiety one has been carrying around for no reason. It is amazing to realize that cherished breakthroughs, such as mental clarity, peace of mind, and unwavering confidence, are not achieved by adding anything from the outside, but rather by ridding ourselves of unnecessary complexity in our inner world. Traditionally, we are taught that triumph and well-being are the result of relentless action, careful planning, and a desire to control every detail of our lives. However, the truth lies in the ability to sift out the mental noise that obscures what we already know, how we feel, and what we really are. The incessant mental strain of miscalculating each successive step is not true insight, but only an illusion of progress that masks inner restlessness. It is here that an important nuance is revealed. People who exude confidence, charm, and peacefulness do not exhaust themselves with continuous thought processes. They have simply learned to trust their awareness without seeking to suppress it. It should be understood that thinking is linear in nature, with a certain speed, direction, and structure. Awareness, on the other hand, is open, silent, and direct. It does not pursue goals, but merely observes. It does not predict the future, but responds flexibly to the present. When a person moves away from the continuous flow of thoughts and begins to live consciously, something subtle but powerful happens in his life. He no longer feels the urgent need to constantly prepare for future events. This is not because of indifference, but because he develops the ability to be in the present moment and respond to situations with clarity and calm. It is in this state of presence that his true power lies. Instead of mentally running 10 steps ahead, one begins to feel a sense of stability and confidence in the present. He becomes less impulsive and more balanced, allowing him to avoid becoming overly exhausted. Decision-making ceases to be a complex mental task, becoming a natural, instinctive, and quick act. However, here lies an important nuance. This state cannot be achieved by forcing oneself to be conscious. It comes when one realizes that one is already in the here and now. Silence does not need to be conquered or earned. You just need to stop running away from it. This is why one should not let thoughts constantly occupy the mind, for true wisdom is not hidden in the next thought, but in the silence that waits beneath them until one stops and notices it. In today's world, silence has become suspect. If a person is not talking, writing, typing, scrolling through a feed, or making plans, those around them may think something is wrong with them. Even the person themselves may feel anxious, as if they are falling behind because their brain is not multitasking at top speed. But what if the silence is not a gaping void, but the emergence of true reality? Often, the root of the problem lies not in the thinking process itself, but in the lack of skill in hearing life without constant rethinking. There is a whole layer of life experience that is inaccessible to most people, because their thoughts do not allow them to stand still long enough to experience it. This experience is hidden in the pauses between words, in the breath that precedes an utterance, in the space between ideas, where there is no room for reaction or planning, only for being awake in the present moment. It is in this space that something marvelous is born. One gains intuition, acts with clarity, rather than with constant looking back at the past. He becomes less artificial, more present, learns to listen and respond more sensitively. Even idleness begins to bring pleasure, not because of laziness, but because of the cessation of the struggle with silence. This is the truth most people miss. There is no need to fill every second of silence with reflection. The most significant changes in life occur when a person stops trying to calculate their path to success and starts feeling it. There is an intelligence hidden in silence, a knowing that is not expressed in words, but manifests itself in the calm that once evoked violent emotions, in the depths of sleep, in slow breathing, in being present in ordinary moments without seeking to escape from them, in one's thoughts. It is not necessary to completely abandon thought activity, but it is important to stop seeing it as the only authoritative source of information. Once one makes room for mindfulness, allowing it to manifest freely, one begins to notice that life is constantly trying to make contact with one. However, life does not impose its opinion, but rather shares it in the form of a barely perceptible whisper. There is a unique freedom that most people unfortunately never experience. This freedom occurs not when one achieves one's goals or gets rid of one's shortcomings, but when one realizes that there is no need to constantly analyze everything that happens. There is no need to grasp at every thought, react to every fleeting impression, or subject every situation to careful analysis in order to live a fulfilling life. Not everything requires reflection. Some things just need to be present. There is no need to form an opinion on every subject or mentally play out every possible future scenario. Nor is it necessary to overinterpret silence in a conversation. Sometimes silence is just silence, and that is enough. In modern society, the belief that a person's worth is directly proportional to his or her productivity is deeply ingrained, which creates a constant internal pressure that pushes for continuous activity. The impression is that any minute without active work is time wasted. However, true understanding and clarity do not come through obsessive planning and listing of tasks, but rather arise spontaneously, like a stream of water, free from the obstacles of logical analysis. This shift in perception can dramatically change a person's inner world. When thinking is perceived not as a prerequisite but as an option, space opens up for trust in the pauses between thoughts, in moments of stillness and peace. The result is a sense of greater stability and confidence, not imposed from the outside but arising naturally through the release of excessive control over that which does not require constant management. Externally, this manifests itself in slower speech, improved capacity for empathic listening, and a deeper connection to ongoing activities, even if they consist of complete inactivity. It is important to realize that constant thinking is not a prerequisite for a fulfilling life, not because thought itself is harmful, but because the world around us does not require continuous competition. It patiently waits for the moment when a person stops filling every quiet minute with mental noise, and then the world reveals itself in all its fullness and beauty. The next time there is an unbearable desire to interrupt the silence, it is worth trying to let it last a little longer, not for the purpose of provoking an event, but to experience the forgotten state when nothing is supposed to happen. And herein lies a truth that probably wasn't talked about as a child. Everyone is allowed to be deeply aware without burdening themselves with a mental description of every moment. Allowed to move through the day without being immersed in the incessant problem-solving in your head. It is allowed to simply exist without justifying every second with a stream of thoughts. The modern world extols constant stimulation and continuous movement. Society rewards the loudest voice, the quickest mind, and the sharpest response. Yet few people talk about the power of inaction, the ability to not engage every thought, pursue every conclusion, or fill every second with mental gymnastics. People who radiate peacefulness, those who, by their mere appearance in a room, soothe the atmosphere around them, do not think less because of a lack of intelligence. They think less because they have realized that intelligence does not always manifest itself in shouting. Sometimes it just observes, listens intently, and waits for the moment that really matters. And then it shows up with clarity instead of chaos. When a person stops placing the entire burden of mental activity solely on his mind, an amazing truth opens up before him. The true realization of reality is always there. It is not buried under piles of self-improvement literature or hidden behind the horizon of future discoveries. It is present all the time, patiently waiting for the moment when attention will be drawn to it again. Perhaps the feeling of fatigue, mental exhaustion, or invisible burden is not caused by an internal breakdown, but by overthinking things that did not originally require thought. The mind should serve as a tool, not become an abode. When silence comes, one should not be in a hurry to fill it with anything. You should welcome it like an old friend, allowing yourself to be reminded of what it means to just be here, without having to explain it. If the reader has reached the end of this reflection, it is suggested to leave the comment, "I am not my thoughts." These words will be a sign that he or she has not just heard, but felt what was said. And if there is a willingness to share this revelation, it is worth sending it to someone who has been in a state of mental overload for too long. Perhaps he also needs a pause. Until the next meeting, it is important to stay in the present moment, to stay in touch with reality, and to protect your inner world as the precious treasure that it has always been and is.